I'm Mike Berenson, and this is a presentation of Colorado Captures. I teach night photography workshops in Arches and Canyonlands National Park in Utah and in Teton National Park in Wyoming. I hope you'll consider joining me on one of my workshops where students learn all they can about shooting the Milky Way stars. This is a video tutorial. We'll talk about blending multiple exposures in Photoshop. And while this is intended primarily for night photography students, it may also be useful for landscape and photographers in general. In this tutorial, we'll look at three different things. First, we'll look at why even bother blending. Second, we'll look at how to blend, and we'll look at three different approaches to blending multiple exposures. And third, we'll look at a few suggested guidelines for blending. Why would I even bother blending? Well, that's a really good question. And the answer is that I want the best possible quality, not just in the sky, but also in the foreground. And what I find is that there's an especially big challenge when I'm shooting at night. And the reason is because, well, one is there's lower light, and the other is because the stars are moving. And between the two of those, it really limits the amount of exposure time that I can work with, and it also means that I tend to work with the higher ISO settings, which again translates to more noise and lower quality, especially in the foreground and in the shadows. So what I find is that when I'm shooting at night, if I'm limited to one exposure, that I tend to have more noise in the foreground than I would if I were able to shoot a second exposure as well as the one for the sky, another one for the foreground where I can shoot a longer exposure time at a lower ISO setting. And again, I can do that because the foreground isn't moving, but I need to be able to blend those two exposures, the one for the sky, that's the higher ISO, and the one for the foreground, that's the lower ISO and the longer exposure time. And I want to blend the two of those together often. And that's where the blending skills come in, and that's where this tutorial comes in. So hopefully this will be of help to you. How to blend multiple exposures. Well, there are three approaches that I like to show off because they really allow me to do a lot with a little bit amount of time. And three approaches are, first off, where I use a mask with a hard edge brush, and I also use a little bit of edge detection. The two in combination work very, very well. Second approach is where I use a soft edge brush with feathering, and the third approach is where I set my blending mode to light, and then I just mask out some of the stars that get doubled up. So let's take a look at those. If you're interested in following along, make sure to download the source files for this video tutorial. Now, anytime that I want to blend multiple exposures in Photoshop, I really want to do two steps with them initially, and I'm going to show you what those two steps are. First, I want to open them into Photoshop as layers, because that saves me a little bit of time. And the next thing is I want to be able to apply Photoshop's auto align functionality, because that really helps to be able to take my images and be able to make sure that they're perfectly lined up before I start the blending process. So you'll notice that here I am in Lightroom, and I've got two images selected here at the bottom in the film strip. And these images both come from a series and sequence where I was shooting from Dream Lake in Rocky Mountain National Park. And I've got a little bit of focus stacking going on in these two images, where the first one shows that I'm focused in the distance. I've got the stars and the mountain peaks, and that light beam is in focus. And then the next image, it shows that I've got a little bit of light painting going on where the crack in the foreground and the details start to draw the eye in. So what I'm looking for is, as an artist, I'm looking for the ability to combine the two of these in a blend where I can have a natural transition, ideally, between the crack in the foreground and those mountain peaks and the stars in the background. So that's what I'm after as an artist, and I'm hoping that I can make that happen through this tutorial and actually give a couple different ways to be able to do it. So let's start out, as I said, by opening these two images into Photoshop. So I'm going to right click on the two of these. After I've selected the two of them, I'm going to right click, and then I'm going to move my cursor over Edit, and then while it's tempting to choose this Edit in Photoshop, I'm actually going to choose this one at the bottom, the Open as Layers in Photoshop. And the two are pretty similar, but the difference is that instead of having two independent images that I can edit independently, I have one image where the two images that I selected in Lightroom are actually combined into one, and the two of them will appear over here on this Layers palette as two separate layers, and that's how I'll be able to control them. And no, they're not blended yet, but that's up to us to start doing the blending. At least the two are combined in that they both appear here on the layers palette. So that saved us a step or two. So now that the two are loaded, I'm going to go ahead and show you what it looks like with without the alignment applied. So I'm going to enlarge this image and show it at the maximum size that's viewable, and that is the Control 0 key, and that's what allows me to show it as, once again, the maximum viewable size. So once that's done, now I'm going to enable and disable that first layer, and you'll notice that if you keep an eye on the peaks up here, you'll notice that when I enable and disable, that those peaks really do a little bit of jumping around. And in a way that's a little disappointing, because I did shoot this image on a tripod, and you would think that we wouldn't have a problem with that. But it's surprising how often it happens where images in sequence need a little bit of alignment so that they can really be perfectly lined up. But regardless, I'm not going to lose any sleep over it. I'm going to select the two images now that we can see that issue. And now that we've got both layers selected over there on the right, now I'm going to come up here to Edit and then Auto Align. And once I select that, I'm going to accept the default auto projection parameters, and I'm going to click OK. And I'm going to let Photoshop do some analysis of these images, and it's going to find that, yes, in fact, a little bit of alignment is helpful. So if I enable and disable that top layer, you can see that those peaks are much better aligned. It really did a very good job of that. Now, keep in mind that, especially with night photography, this does not always work very well. And in fact, when you have a night photography image where you might have a lot of underexposing going on and there's just not enough detail, then Photoshop's going to kind of struggle with being able to figure out what's going on with that image, and it may guess, and it may turn one of the images 90 degrees. And if that's the case, make sure that you undo that in history and revert back, because you won't want to use that in your blend. But in this case, as we saw, it works pretty well. So that's nice to see. So those are the first two steps that we're going to do. We're going to open up our images that we're going to blend into Photoshop as layers. And if we can't do that automatically through our command, we're going to make sure that we're going to do that so that we can get them organized as layers into one image. And then we're going to apply the auto align function so that we can make sure that our images are perfectly aligned and ready for blending. Now that we're ready for blending, what we're going to do is we're going to select our first image and in the layers, and we're going to apply a mask with a hard brush so that we can use edge detection. So in adding a mask, we're just going to come down here to this toolbar on the bottom, and we're going to click on the washing machine shaped icon so that we can add a mask. And I want to point out that there are two different icons here now. We've got our image data that appears here on the left, and the reason I mention this is because we're about to paint with a brush, and we want to make sure not to select the image data because we don't want to paint on that. We actually want to make sure to paint on the mask itself. So if you see anything funny going on, oftentimes you want to make sure to come in here and make sure that you've got the mask selected. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to click on the B key or click on the brush over here on the left, and that will enable the brush, and we're going to make sure to paint with a black brush. The painting with a black brush on a white mask works well. And then we're going to come up here and we're going to select our edge hardness, and that's where we're going to select, if you notice, we select the soft brush that we get a 0 hardness, and if we select the hard brush, then we're going to get 100% hardness. And that's in fact what we want in this case. So I'm going to leave it on 100% hardness. I'm going to click on the void off to the left to make that dialog go away. And the next key I'm going to use is the open and close bracket key. That will make my brush bigger and smaller, so that's very helpful. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to paint on this mask so that I can trace the foreground line where the shoreline at the far end of the shore, at the far end of the lake, is meeting with the snow line and the rest of the mountain. So once I've done that, I've done a very rough job. I'm not trying to fill it in exactly. I'm not trying to spend much time on it. In fact, if you notice when I zoom in that I've got some imperfections in here, and that's not intentional, but I certainly am not trying to spend time on this, and I want to show you why. The reason is because when I right click on this mask over here on the right, I'm going to add further refinement to that mask. And if I move this dialog box out of the way, and you'll notice if I move, say, over to the left, see how I've got hard lines along the shore? Well, I'm going to come up here to edge detection, and I'm going to add a smart radius. Nothing happens exciting then. But then I increase this radius up to around 100, and once I stop moving and it does some processing, you'll see that Photoshop did some changes in here with the mask, and it made some changes that I couldn't have really done myself. And it's interesting, it has some textures in some areas. It's really interesting how it makes that line a lot more filled in a way that it makes that transition a lot smoother. Let's take a look at the right side of the shore, and it does something very similar where it adds some texture to that line. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK and see how that looks, because it's going to apply that mask to the first layer, and we'll see how that looks once I zoom out. I'm going to hit the Control-0 key, and that's what shows that image once again at maximum size, maximum viewable size. And so what I'm going to do is enable and disable that top layer, and you'll see it doesn't do a bad job of being able to fill in that top layer with a pretty neat transition, a pretty gradual transition. So in general, if you have a natural line that makes for a good transition between one image and another, maybe you have a transition where you've got a horizon line where you've got land on the bottom and sky on the top, and a lot of times you'll find that the hard edge and the edge detection can combine to do a really good job of making that edge form a natural transition. So keep that in mind in a lot of the images that you're working in, that you can let Photoshop do a lot of the work. Now I want to take a look at the other approach with masking, where we use a soft edge and some feathering. So first thing I want to do is go back in history to the point where we added a mask. And instead of painting on the mask with a hard brush, we're going to make sure to paint with a soft brush. And here we go. Now what I want to do as an artist is I'm looking to combine the best elements from both of these two images, both of these two layers. In the top one, I've got the reflection that comes down here that extends down into the ice from that light beam, and I really like that. I really like the ripples, and so I want to keep that. But I also like, when you look down at the bottom image, I also like a lot of the detailed bubbles and crack that appears in the bottom portion as well. And I'd really like to have both of those at the same time. And that's where I like the fact that I can be a little more selective with deciding where I want to include and where I do not. So I'm going to go ahead and do a little bit of tracing where I've got the mask, or excuse me, where I've got the crack in the foreground, because I definitely want to include this horizontal crack that's appearing. So I've got that. I'm going to make my brush a little smaller now, and now I'm going to trace along this crack that leads the eye into the distance. And I really wanted to be able to keep that being, something that draws the eye from this detailed crack in the foreground, but yet I didn't want to lose all this reflected area and all these ripples. So this is kind of a neat way where I can get both. And so I want to take a look at what my mask looks like. And yes, you can see it over here. It's kind of small, but I want to get a better view of it. So I'm going to hold down the Alt key while I click on the mask, and that's going to show what my mask looks like in black and white. And it allows me to fix some of the imperfections that I may have, or make little changes. And it really helps to be able to see it just in black and white without any of the texture. And it also allows me to do something else, and that's make use of the feathering. So I'm going to double click on this mask, and it brings up this properties dialog. And if I have any trouble getting the properties dialog to appear, there's another way to do it, and that's where I come up here to Window, and then I choose Properties right up here. So if you have any difficulty, that's another way to get to it. And what I'm after here is this feathering slider, and I'm going to increase this on up to something really high so you can see that there's feathering. But the nice part about this is that it's not destructive. And so let's say that I close this image, I've saved it with a lot of feathering. Well, I can come back and I can bring back my detail from my original mask without it, as I said, without having to maintain the history and without having to make a destructive change. So it's kind of nice being able to do that. So in this case, I'm just going to increase it to around 200 or so. I'm going to leave it there, and then I'm going to Alt-click on that mask once again so that I can see what it looks like. And here it is with and without the top image masked in, and it's really kind of neat to be able to see that I was successful in getting definitely the crack leading off in the distance, and also the reflected light from that beam. And I like that the eye is going to start hopefully down here in the details in the foreground, and it's going to lead off toward in the distance, either following that crack in the ice or following that beam of light that's reflected in the ripples. And it's got kind of a choice, but either one of them is going to catch the eye from the foreground on up to the top. And so I like the way that I got away with having both of them in the same image with kind of a nice smooth transition from the foreground to the background. And so in the end, this is the same approach. This feathered approach with the soft brush is the approach that I used when I ended up posting this image, because I was pretty happy with being able to have elements from both the foreground image and the background image where I focused on each one. Now, when talking about blending multiple exposures, I want to make sure to include the concept of blending modes, because blending modes is a really powerful approach to blending multiple exposures in Photoshop that really deserves some attention. And really, it doesn't take very much effort, but more importantly, it allows us to take on blending images that have a lot of complexity. As you can see here in the trees, that would really take us a long time, and I'm not sure how I do it because edge detection in the hard brush, I don't see that working real well, or at least not quickly. And the soft edge with the feathering isn't going to work real well either. It's going to have problems as well. So let's take a look at how the blending modes will work here. So first thing that I want to do is I want to explain my two images. I've got images that are taken from Alberta Falls in Rocky Mountain National Park, and I've got two exposures from the same location. The first one here is taken at ISO 6400, and this one is taken so that at a higher ISO with a lot more detail in the stars, and then at a higher quality I'm taking at ISO 1600, where I can do a little bit of light painting in the foreground to fill it in. But the key is that the lower ISO is going to give me better quality, but I also wanted to make sure to have good detailed stars. So I'm looking to blend the two of these together. And how do I do that? Well, probably the best way that I can think of, at least the approach that came to mind here, because of the complexity of this blend here and the detail in the trees up here, really just goes into looking at blending modes and using lighten as a blending mode. So first thing that I want to do is select my two images as I've got selected here, and then I'm going to right click, choose edit in, and I'm going to open not in Photoshop directly, but I'm going to go into Photoshop as layers. And just like I did before, it's going to combine these two images into one. It's not going to do the blending yet, but it's just going to combine the two. One thing I will say here is that I'm not going to use the auto align function because at least I've found that in practicing with this image that the one image without the light painting at the higher ISO has so little detail in the foreground that at least I believe that causes the auto align function to really fail, and it really looks pretty hokey when you're done with it. And by that, what I mean is that it'll take one of the images and it'll turn it about 90 degrees, and it's pretty obvious that it's not something you want to keep. So just go back. If you ever see that, just look at your history, go back one step, and make sure to undo that, and then proceed with blending. So let's take a look at our two layers. We've got them lined up, at least fairly well. And what I'm going to do in order to blend is I'm just going to take this top layer and I'm going to change this blending mode from normal, as it's already selected by default, and I'm going to change that from normal, come down here to lighten. And boy, doesn't that make a huge difference right away. Let's hit Control 0 so that we can look at this a little bit larger. And boy, that really does show a combination of the foreground and the sky, and it does a great job. I do want to point out, though, that it has one pretty significant flaw, or at least one item that we're going to need to pay attention to. And I'm going to show you what that is. And that is that, when you're shooting, the foreground is all completely still. So if you do multiple exposures and you have 5 minutes between the two, there's not going to be any difference between the two unless your tripod moves or your camera moves. But in that time, the sky is doing something. The sky is moving and it's changing position, it's rotating, it's doing all kinds of things. And as a result, when you're showing two exposures together using lighten, you're actually seeing the results of the stars from both of those exposures. And one of them is ISO 6400, so that's a little brighter. And while the ISO 1600 is not quite as bright, you're still going to see some of those stars. So let me show you where you can see some of them. And I'm zoomed in a little bit. I'm going to zoom in just a little more. And we'll see we've got some doubled up stars here. Let me show you what happens when I enable and disable them. And now you can see them flashing. And the point of that is that this is a defect that some people might find this on the web. I would think so. If you couldn't find it on the web, you would certainly see it when you go to print. And the long and short of it is that it's just a defect that I do not want to let make its way into my final image. So I want to make sure when I'm doing a blend that I clean up things like this. This is definitely an artifact I want to fix. So how do we fix this? Well, the easiest way that I know of is to go ahead and select the image with the stars that we don't want to keep. That's this guy. I'm going to add a mask, and by doing that I'm going to click on this little washing machine icon down here. So I've added a mask. It's a white mask, so I'm going to paint with a brush that's colored black. I'm going to make sure that I've got a hard edge brush, and then I'm ready to paint. I'm going to get a little smaller on the brush size. There we go. And I'm going to paint out the mask, or out the stars that are doubled. And that seems to work pretty good in painting them out. But this is a little tedious, so I'm going to get a little larger. I'm going to do a Control-0 to show my full image. I'm going to enlarge my brush size, and I'm going to get rid of, or should I say, I'm going to paint out or mask out a lot more of the stars at once. And I'm going to be pretty efficient about how I'm going to do it. Then I'm going to get a little smaller, and I'm going to come in here and I'm going to paint out some of those, and I'm going to paint out some of these, and I'm going to get a little smaller and paint out some of these. And I might do the same over here. And I might do the same over here where I identify the stars that are doubled up. But the point is that I do not need to go in here and be tedious enough and detailed enough in order to get all the transitions with all of the twigs. I certainly do not want to do that. Again, the beauty of this approach is that all I'm doing is masking out the doubled up stars. So let's click with the Alt button, press down, and let's click on our mask, and it shows what our mask looks like. And it shows if we have any imperfections, let's say we missed in the middle or an area that we want to make sure to include. It's kind of nice to be able to do that. And the other thing it's useful for is seeing how we can apply feathering. And rather than using the refine mask and feathering, I suggest that we double click on the mask itself, and that brings up the properties dialog. And if you have any difficulty seeing that, make sure to just come up here to Window and then choose Properties, and that'll make it appear as well. So when the Properties dialog is selected on the mask, it'll show this feathering slider, and the feathering slider can be applied directly to the mask. I'm going to bring it up pretty high, up to say around 200 or so, or even more, and you'll see that it's applied. And the nice part about this thing, about this slider, is that it's non-destructive and that it remembers what it's doing even after you've lost history. So if you close the image, open it back up, you can then come in and change this feathering and actually bring back some of the sharpness of the mask. So it's really kind of useful. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to Alt-click on my mask to get back to the regular image without having the black and white version of the mask. And I'm going to see what it looks like with and without, and make sure that I've actually gotten rid of, or should I say masked out, those doubled up stars. So how do I do that? Well, I'm going to Shift and click on the mask, and that disables the mask. And that, in fact, it does work pretty well in making sure that I've masked out those doubled up stars. And let's try that again. There we go. We've got the doubled up stars that were there without the mask, and with the mask that I put in, now they're no longer there. And fortunately, that worked in a way where I didn't have to worry about the edges with the trees. All I did was, as I said, target the stars. So that approach works really well when you have, as I said, a textured, or should I say, a complex transition between your foreground and your background. Again, that's using the lighten mode and using a mask to just mask out the doubled up stars. Suggested guidelines for blending. Along with the tremendous power of blending multiple exposures in Photoshop comes some responsibility. So I wanted to include a couple of suggested guidelines here in this tutorial on how to handle that responsibility. First on my list is to only use content that's our own. And this may go without saying for most people, but there are a few people out there on the internet who've shown me that this needs to be first on my list when it comes to blending. So there, I've done it, I've got it out of the way, and now I can move on to number two. And number two is to consider using only content that's captured in sequence. And this is an approach that isn't for everyone. It is an approach that I like to use, even though it does make it more challenging. And what it means is that I'm only including content that I actually saw with my eye, or the camera actually saw, because it was captured at the same place and at the same time. I'm not adding elements later on that weren't planned or weren't included in the scene, being like Milky Way or Moon. I've actually got to work to make sure that those elements are in position when I'm out in the field. And again, that makes it more challenging. It's not for everyone, but that's a standard that I like to do as a form of honesty, and it really makes the process a lot easier for my viewers to understand what it is that I'm representing. In the end, though, I expect that you are the artist, and you are making your artistic vision come to life. You're determining what it is that you want to include in your artistic vision. And no one's going to make those decisions but you. And I encourage you to make those decisions in any way that you see fit. And it's up to you to do that. And I'm not going to apply any restrictions whatsoever. I will ask you, however, to follow number 4, being that you are honest and forthcoming with your viewers
about what it is that you're including in your image. And if you include multiple locations, I would hope that you will include that in your descriptions or whatever you include to communicate to your viewers in an honest and forthcoming nature that you had multiple locations or significantly varied exposure times, because again, that's a form of honesty that I would like to see and encourage people to follow. Why is this important? Well, it's important because we're maintaining the integrity and the perceptions of the phrase composite image. And the phrase composite image means different things to different people. It brings up forms of image manipulation that raises another debate that I'm not even going to get into. But I am going to ask you to keep in mind that our images influence those perceptions. And it's very important that we keep that in mind when we make decisions, not just about what components to include, but more so about how to be honest and forthcoming about what's included in our images themselves. In this tutorial, we took a look at 3 different items. First of all, we looked at why even bother blending, before we moved on to number 2, which was how to blend, including 3 different approaches that we used in blending. Finally, we moved on to number 3, which was suggested guidelines on blending. For more information, I hope you'll take a look at my website, where I have free articles and tutorials on night photography. Over the years of teaching night photography workshops, there are a lot of questions that have come up from students that have fed the articles and tutorials. So it really is a great source of information, both for students who are looking to take a workshop or for students just looking to learn on their own. Besides that, I hope you'll consider taking one of my night photography workshops. I teach them in Arches and Canyonlands National Park in Utah, and also in Teton National Park in Wyoming. And they are in hand-picked locations at hand-picked times, so it's a wonderful opportunity to capture some night images. But it's also a great opportunity to learn all you can under the Milky Way stars with some patient instructors, so I hope you'll consider joining. I'm Mike Berenson. This has been a presentation of Colorado Captures. Thank you for watching.